When Microsoft secretly, but officially, decided to go into the home console market in late 1999, it had just about everything a company could want at its disposal. It had more than brand recognition. It had complete and total domination over the world's computer markets. It had infinite financial resources to spend. It had very relevant adjacent technical expertise in computer hardware engineering, graphic software APIs, as well as software development resources on a scale few companies or even governments could match. What it didn't have was the one thing a video game console maker needed: games. The company had only decided to acknowledge the importance of gaming 40 years earlier at the launch of Windows 95, when it developed the DirectX system to tie together all the 3D graphics cards on the market into one unified graphics language. It turned its very well-regarded hardware division that had put out some of the best mouse and keyboard devices on the market towards the task of also designing game controllers, which became some of the benchmark products for those PC gamers that choose to play with controllers. It leveraged its MSN network of internet sites to wade into the growing market for online gaming networks with the MSN Gaming Zone. Finally, it stood up its own Microsoft Game Studios to begin putting its money and its name behind some hit PC games like Age of Empires, MechWarrior, and Asheron's Call. This would seem like the answer to their problem. But the important part of that last sentence was that these were hit PC games. As well regarded as Age of Empires was by people who played PCs, it wasn't very likely to translate over to a game console. Likewise, the more complicated mech simulation or Microsoft's own flight simulator were not very well suited to compete in the same market dominated by the likes of Crash Bandicoot, Tekken, Donkey Kong 64, or Sonic Adventure. So as far as recruiting and building up a bench of talent, Microsoft was essentially starting from scratch. It had a virtually unlimited pocketbook, but it still needed to do the hard work of a proverbial talent scout, fanning out across the world looking for studios, programmers, new ideas, and workable software it could pick up and turn into games that would sell consumers on its Xbox console. It would plant the seeds for dozens of titles with many more studios. One of those lucky enough to catch the company's eye was a brand new company called Pseudo Interactive. Pseudo Interactive was founded in Toronto, Canada in 1995 by David Wu, Rich Hilmer, and Daniel Posner. Wu was a mathematics whiz who specialized in the creation and application of physics within game environments. The group would take his work as a basis for a game they began to work on and pitch to publishers that they called Inertia. This is the initial project that caught the eye of Microsoft shortly after they showed it at the Game Developers Conference in 1997. This was Microsoft's nascent PC games division, and they would help fund the studio as it expanded to more than a dozen employees, and took its Inertia project and renamed it as Full Auto, meant to be a car combat game in a similar vein to games like Twisted Metal, albeit on the PC. The project continued apace into 1999, when it was supposedly on the verge of shipping, but something X-shaped appeared on the way to the finish line. While Microsoft was getting more and more intertwined in the video game market as the PC gaming industry boomed, it was on a collision course with Sony's newly announced PlayStation 2, which promised not just to be a game console, but a multimedia hub of the living room, promising to double as a DVD player and triple as an internet device. This became the strategic impetus behind getting into the console market, but the actual product that it ended up with was the result of a group of internal entrepreneurs led by a gentleman named Seamus Blackley. Blackley had fled to Microsoft after the failure of the last game project he had worked on for DreamWorks Interactive, Trespasser, a Jurassic Park game that shipped for the PC in late 1998 that was widely panned by critics and quickly became a commercial bomb. But one thing that it had going for it was a very advanced physics engine that Blackley had been instrumental in creating. It was thanks to the reputation and credibility he had from this part of the project that he was invited to a panel discussion on physics implementations in games at GDC 1999. A panel that featured none other than David Wu from Pseudo Interactive. At the time, Pseudo was still firmly partnered with the Microsoft PC games division and was on track to ship Full Auto in the near future according to Wu. But Blackley's little project would turn all that upside down. With the promise seen in this studio, particularly its advanced physics engine work, they were scouted as an exemplary studio to get in on the ground floor of the Xbox project, and by the time 1999 turned into 2000, they had changed course, and Full Auto transformed yet again into a new concept called Cartoon Mayhem, which looked to take the underlying concept of car combat, but set it in a fully cartoonized universe. After all, by the year 2000, cel shading was starting to emerge in fits and starts, and was one of the cutting-edge graphical techniques of that time, and Microsoft wanted the projects it was funding to front the Xbox lineup to stand out, and do new things, and create new intellectual property. However, by early 2000, Pseudo Interactive looked at what it had put together over the past 2 years, and came to the undesirable conclusion that they would need to start over on their original game engine in order to complete what they were working on for Microsoft. But this was a very poor window of time to be going dark with nothing to show, since Microsoft spent the rest of 2000 furiously pouring time and resources into studios it could get on crash courses to bring something workable to the table by the end of the following year. So with the company going back to square one on its engine, and unable to show anything further iterating on its initial work, Microsoft cut their funding for the studio by the end of winter 2000. Despite going 5 years from founding, and not yet having shipped anything, Pseudo Interactive persevered in finishing what they had started, and not long after Microsoft cut them loose, they were able to start demonstrating what their new engine could do, and quickly they were able to find another publisher, in this case Electronic Arts. The game was able to get back on track to ship for the Xbox launch as well, just not as a Microsoft title anymore. But their work was far from done. In the post-mortem article that David Wu himself penned for GameDeveloper.com, formerly known as Gamasutra, he explained that 3 months out from their completion date, they had worked out the bulk of the gameplay, physics, graphics, and controls to make the core of the game, but they still needed to add all the additional elements that wrapped it up as a finished product. This included cutscenes, the menu interfaces, music, voice acting, and sound effects. For this, they contracted out to companies that specialized in these aspects of game production. But just to give you an idea, I'll quote from Wu's article on the size of the order they placed. Quote, "We drew up a shopping list that looks something like this. 13 cutscene scripts and storyboards, 12 pieces of in-game music, a theme song, interface music, 450 sound effects, 1,000 lines of in-game dialogue, and 200 lines of cutscene dialogue to be read by 7 different voice actors, 6 minutes of Foley sound and cutscene music, and 6 man-months of modeling and animation talent." End quote. Despite this last-minute crunch to polish the bells and finish the whistles, they were able to successfully ship for the Xbox launch, and garnered some positive press and impressions from their original IP and very slick and stylistic cartoon art style. But the company was no longer tied to Microsoft, and instead working with a third-party publisher, and this meant they could ship for whatever other system they wanted to. Although the PS2 was the 100-pound gorilla in the marketplace, interestingly, Pseudo and EA chose to add only the GameCube to their future plans, announcing in late October, just before the Xbox launch, that the game would also be getting a GameCube version shortly after launch, and promising that this version would take full advantage of that system's hardware as well. In fact, this surprise flip into the GameCube fold may have been foretold a bit earlier than October. In the August 2001 issue of Next Generation magazine, Peter Main of Nintendo of America gave an interview where he was asked about the prospects of third-party support for the GameCube. He acknowledged, without naming them, that a company like Microsoft could come into the marketplace with a lot more money to throw around on developers than Nintendo, but this might not always be the wisest thing, as he shared that many, if not most of these deals had been relatively free of any strings, and thus allowed these studios to turn right around and port their completed games over to the GameCube. Again, he doesn't name names here, but reading between these lines, it would seem highly likely that assuming any of these products made it to market, he would have been referring to projects like Cell Damage, if not directly to this game. There aren't that many other games that Microsoft had a hand in funding and steering through much of its development that landed on the GameCube. Although it also wasn't as perfectly no strings attached as Main says, since Wu does mention in his post-op on the game that after being dropped by Microsoft, the studio did need to redo many of its art assets and characters in order to avoid conflicts with intellectual property that Microsoft could contest from their work together. But with that out of the way, the road was indeed pretty open to take the game over to the GameCube, and in a very short turnaround time, since it shipped for Nintendo's system less than 2 months after Microsoft's. A testament that Nintendo's development environment and powerful console were indeed as friendly and easy to work with as they said, and also likely that the GameCube port started sometime before the Xbox version was done. Still, Cell Damage actually has the distinction of being the first GameCube game to hit store shelves in 2002, shipping just 1 week in on January 7th. While the game was only slightly tweaked for things like difficulty adjustments based on feedback that the Xbox version was too difficult, they did live up to their word that the game would take advantage of the GameCube hardware, since this game that the studio had very explicitly made to try and take advantage of everything Microsoft's behemoth Xbox had to offer, came right on over to Nintendo's little purple cube completely intact, with its entire graphic style and physics model in place, running at 60 frames a second, and being one of the rare third-party GameCube games to match its Xbox counterpart and offer a 480p progressive scan mode. There's also one huge dividing line between these two versions. In January of 2002, GameCube players had the familiar controller that we all know and love, while Xbox players had this thing. With all due respect to my friends who love the Duke, it's not the most ergonomic, comfortable, or wieldy controller in the world, and it was still a few months from being replaced by Microsoft with its Japanese Model S controller. So one could easily make the call between these two versions based on which controller they'd rather use. I think you can pick up from what I'm saying here which one I would choose. So let's jump into this cel-shaded take on Twisted Metal. As always, this means cutscene time. In this case, the intro cutscene is short and sweet and plays some purpose since it explains the central conceit of the game, setting up the whole game as being staged for content for a television show. The menu looks a bit simple and static, but knowing the last-minute rush that went into throwing elements like this together, it actually makes some sense. Putting aside the settings, which offer next to nothing to customize, and the pretty standard rolling credits sequence with a few art concepts, the only other thing here aside from the game is the intro movies that introduce you to each of the game's characters. It's a nice little touch to set you up on what kind of character archetype each of them are, but each character kind of comes off as a more generic dollar store version of something else. There's a stereotypically nerdy character, a vapid socialite, a mischievous devil ejected from hell, a 1930s black and white noir talking duck character, and a middle-aged faux macho Elvis impersonating guy. There's also some kind of bat lady with a painfully apparent overabundance of attitude. Leading into the play mode, when you go to start up the actual game, you're immediately greeted with a 4-way split-screen character select. And no, you did not accidentally choose the multiplayer mode. The game starts off with this. Cell Damage is basically a hybrid single-player multiplayer game. There's no choice between multiplayer and single-player modes. It all depends on how many human players you input here. The game you play after that will be the same, just with screens split 1 to 4 ways. This is technically a very streamlined way to present the game. It's just so different than most other games that at first it's a little jarring. But this is a design choice. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. So whether you've chosen single player or multiplayer, you then have the choice between the same 3 game modes. Smash Attack, which is the primary mode of the game, an all-out brawl. Gate Relay, a kind of racing laps mode. And Flag Rally, which naturally is a capture the flag style game, with violence. Before whichever match you choose, you can set the parameters of the battle, a bit like Super Smash Bros. Then you get to choose which level you jump into, with only the first of each of the worlds unlocked. With 3 levels in each of the 4 worlds, there's a total of 12 levels. There are a few unlockable characters, but other than that, that's all the content to the game. If you're determined enough to play through every level in each game mode with each character, you get some ending movies akin to their intro movies, but that's quite a lot of play for that little content to pay off. So once you actually get into a game, you're dropped into one of these big cartoon arenas, and you go. Now in Cell Damage, the system for combat is a little different. Rather than having a life bar to deplete and kill enemies, the game is counting the number of hits you get in on each other. A high number of hits, or certain one-blow weapons will still destroy a character's car and set them back to respawning, and they do count for more hits. But like with Super Smash Bros., this game is trying a different formula that's a bit handicapped to allow for more equalizing effects between players, and makes the flow of the competition very dynamic and very fast-paced. It is of course, as we've said, a car combat game, so it's very similar to games like Twisted Metal. But of course the main conceit of the game is the cartoon style, since that's right in the name. Back in 2001, cel shading was one of the undercurrents within the industry. While games were racing forward trying to get more and more realistic, here was a style choice that went in the other direction and became more and more stylistic. For Cel Damage, it paid off, as the art style and graphics were universally hailed as one of the best features of the game. But it was not just the fact that the characters and worlds were cel-shaded, it was those physics that Pseudo Interactive was determined to innovate on. Since this is a cartoon-looking world that literally takes place within an actual TV cartoon show in the context of the game's universe, the cartoon setting goes beyond just looks. You'll notice as soon as you start playing that your cars control in a remarkably unnatural manner. When you pull a tight turn, you'll see your car literally bend and rubber band around on a dime, like a classic Looney Tunes cartoon animation. It's not just an animation, but a key part of the game's physics engine, and lets you pull off turnarounds like no game I've ever seen before, let alone back in 2001. Of course, with a cartoon universe and an explicit focus on hitting and killing other characters, the game is loaded with different weapons, which also don't have to obey any of the laws of reality. While you get some standards like chain guns and rockets, there are also wacky things like comical red sticks of dynamite, giant baseball bats, ray guns, and the Kingmaker, a giant fire axe that can chop opponents in half in one hit. While you can have your vehicle explode, this isn't meant to set you back very much, since the game drops you right back into the action within 2 to 3 seconds. It's a very quick, twitchy battle arena game through and through, with a very, very well realized stylistic choice to make it stand out. That said, it's also a game that lacks very much depth or content, let alone any additional bells or whistles. The core gameplay is solid, if a bit repetitive. It just consists of these 3 modes. You have the Battle Royale mode I just described. You have the Gateway Races, which take those very same maps and place a series of gates on the map you need to race around in order while also battling each other, much like games that might have you fly through a series of rings. Plus, there's the Capture the Flag mode, where you do exactly that while also battling each other. It would seem like they had the base game and then tacked on these additional 2 modes to try and make for some different gameplay experiences, but the game was not made specifically with those modes in mind. The controls are also remarkably simple. This is the kind of nearly one-button action that would make Miyamoto proud. The left and right triggers apply acceleration and brake, which makes good sense. The A and B buttons use your weapons, while the C stick and Z button toggle on certain on-screen HUD elements that are totally optional for gameplay, and the X and Y buttons just taunt other players and honk your horn. The D-pad is entirely unused, and of course you steer with the analog stick. It's an incredibly simple control scheme that really highlights the game is about 2 things: driving around and using weapons. The GameCube version does everything promised and matches the Xbox version bit for bit, with all of the same graphics, high frame rates, progressive scan, and content. It's pretty much a perfect port, with a few unspoken tweaks in the background to make the difficulty balance more fair. But whether it was the Xbox version or the GameCube version, Cel Damage did not turn out to be a big enough hit to continue on with. While Pseudo Interactive began early planning for a sequel that would never come to be. Both versions only released in North America and Europe, so no Japanese sales here. Worldwide lifetime sales on the Xbox stand at just 120,000 units, while the GameCube version sold half that at just 60,000 units, putting it in the rung of some of the lowest selling and scarcest GameCube games by the numbers produced. Now, there's nothing wrong with this game. It's pretty fun, it's solidly made, its style is fantastic. It's just a bit of an anachronism. It's like a lot of games that would become popular decades later. It's clearly a multiplayer-first battle royale in the age before online multiplayer gaming. With little in the way of dedicated single-player content, it's a game to break out with friends like other couch co-op titles, but not one you'd sit down for a long marathon session alone with. As might be said in a cereal commercial, it's the kind of game that's part of a well-balanced game library.